Long History's Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 45, Alec Douglas Hume, the archetype. He was Prime Minister between 1963 and 1964. Hello everyone and welcome to Long History's Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. We've called Alec Douglas Hume, the subject of this episode, the archetype. A quick definition of this word that could be complicated is that an archetype is an especially typical example of something or someone. So we're claiming Alec Douglas Hume is a typical something, but what exactly? Well, he is an archetypal Prime Minister. There's a further detail, however. Although he was Prime Minister in the early 1960s, Douglas Hume is actually an archetype of a Prime Minister from, say, the 1700s or the early 1800s, from a time when aristocrats slid in and out of the job of Prime Minister. A Prime Minister as part of a rotating old boys' club. He was an aristocrat, he was a British gentleman, he fit the mould perfectly. Alec Douglas Hume was Prime Minister in the 1960s, when generational changes were happening. Youth culture was booming, and in many ways the UK was at the forefront of that new generation. How did the UK's politics respond? By confidently striding into the future, making the most of the creativity of the new generation to help the UK to throw off the shackles of its empire of World War II and to swing along with its pop stars? Well, no, not yet at least. Instead, by putting Alec Douglas Hume in charge, the UK gave in to one of its default instincts, seeming desperate not to face the future. Instead, it tried to bury itself in its own past. It had done this before, notably in the years up to the 1832 Reform Act, when the immediate lessons the establishment seemed to learn, if any, from US independence and the French Revolution, was to make sure that change in the UK was to be avoided at all costs. 130 years later, in the 1960s, we saw evidence that the country's instinct hadn't changed. By making this archetype the Prime Minister, a nice chap, a decent chap, with an unbeatable pedigree, perfect, well yes, perfect for a Prime Minister from the 1700s, the UK put up firm resistance against the future. How? In the white heat of the new decade, when the winds of change were apparently blowing, did this utterly old-fashioned man get the job? We'll find out the answer here. What was Alec Douglas Hume like? He was well liked, and although we've mentioned the 1700s and early 1800s, he's actually described as an Edwardian aristocrat by one commentator, the Edwardian era notably being the early 1900s. By the way, no one is suggesting, for example, that he went to early Beatles and Rolling Stones concerts. He was a rational, unruffled man. This meant that he was a good managerial type, said to be thoughtful and an intelligent decision-maker. The phrase common-sense conservative was used by one commentator to sum him up. Douglas Hume was only Prime Minister for just under a year, which is another factor that makes him similar to those many PMs from the 1700s. In fact, see any episode from the 1760s of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, and plenty of others in the 1820s for a range of examples. His was the shortest time in office of all the premiers of the late 20th century. Indeed, it wasn't until the 2010s and 2020s that we saw regular short-term premierships return to the UK. They often seem to happen when the establishment is struggling to deal with events. This happened when the 13 colonies were heading towards independence in the 1760s, in the years leading up to that Great Reform Act of 1832, and even during the Brexit debates of the 2010s and 2020s. As the post-war years of the 1950s turned into the 1960s, the UK seemed similarly unsure of its new role as its empire slipped away. So the establishment was clawing around for fresh ideas and landed on one straight from the 1700s. Apparently Douglas Hume was excellent at cricket in his youth. What better game could there be for a British gentleman? He also enjoyed other gentlemen's pursuits such as grouse hunting. He married Elizabeth Arlington in 1936 and would be married to her for 54 years, having 3 daughters. What was the historical background? Douglas Hume was only Prime Minister for a brief time. However, it was a key moment in the Cold War. Just 2 years after the Berlin Wall was built, the campaign for nuclear disarmament was gathering strength as a force, and the growing power of the USSR seemed unstoppable. Mersey Beat was just about to take off, with the Beatles' first single being released in the UK in the same month that Douglas Hume became Prime Minister. The first episode of Doctor Who, in the meantime, was aired just over a month after he began his premiership. We found various figures for the yearly wage during that year. For a manual worker we found a figure of around £915, which is around £23,500 in today's money. For non-manual work we found a figure of £1,200, which is around £31,000 in today's money. For comparison, we found that an average wage for full-time workers today is nearer to £35,000, which, considering the 60-year gap, does seem to suggest that the UK needs a pay rise. What was happening in the US at the time? Douglas Hume had only been in the job for just over a month when the most significant newsworthy event of his premiership and perhaps of the decade, if not the century, happened. However, it happened across the Atlantic when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson then became president and would sign the Civil Rights Act on the 2nd of July 1964, still during Douglas Hume's time in office. Who could vote? Women were finally given the vote on equal terms as men in 1928. After that, there were few electoral changes. However, Douglas Hume's time in office highlights the changes that had taken place over the years, particularly since those reforms of 1832. That was the year when the vote was first given to people outside the aristocracy and landed gentry. By being this archetype, Douglas Hume highlighted both how the country was still in love with a certain type of aristocratic vision of itself, but also how it had moved on in the years since more and more people had got the vote. By 1963, an aristocratic Prime Minister was an anachronism, and Douglas Hume could only become Premier by resigning his title and becoming an elected Member of Parliament. What was Douglas Hume's background? So, we've established Douglas Hume's establishment background. Just in case you didn't quite think he was establishment enough, however, he is a descendant of another Prime Minister, Charles Grey, better known as Earl Grey. He was born in 1903 in one of the smartest parts of London, Mayfair. Taking all this into account, along with his official title of 14th Earl of Hume, if you were to place a bet on the education of this most establishment of men, anyone who's listened to a number of these episodes of Random Prime Minister of the Week will already be able to make a good guess as to where Douglas Hume was educated, and you'd be totally correct. Douglas Hume was one of the 19 premiers to go to Eton, and we've actually had to update our statistics about Oxford University, with Keir Starmer, in charge at the time of the writing of this episode, being the 31st Prime Minister who went to Oxford University. Douglas Hume first became an MP in 1931 and was a notable ally of the Prime Minister just before the breakout of World War II, that was Neville Chamberlain. That meant that Douglas Hume was present during the machinations that led to Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler and his most famous misstep, the Peace for Our Time speech, often misquoted as Peace in Our Time. Careers were made and lost by such alliances during those years, with Churchill's closest colleagues faring much better than those of Chamberlain. Anyone supporting Chamberlain was seen to be on the wrong side of history, and Douglas Hume, however, managed to avoid the fallout for being on Chamberlain's side because he fell ill at the beginning of the 1940s, leaving him bedridden for many months due to a problem with his spine. He spent 2 years in plaster and had to lie down most of that time, a time which he said was quite tortuous. In the 1950s, there were 3 Conservative Party Prime Ministers in succession, beginning with Churchill's peacetime stint in the job in the early 1950s, followed by Anthony Eden, and then Harold Macmillan. At the beginning of that same decade, in the meantime, Douglas Hume inherited his title Earl of Hume, and the land and property that went with it. This also, however, meant that he could no longer be an MP because, due to his title, he had inherited the right to sit in the other of the two UK chambers, the House of Lords. He could no longer be an MP, but could still participate in government, although there were still occasional complaints when non-elected figures were given the top jobs in government. In the 1950s, Douglas Hume was Minister for Scotland, then Secretary of State for Commonwealth Affairs. During Macmillan's administration, he was Foreign Secretary, although at that time there was in particular some grumbling that this man with his inherited title should be in the role. How did Douglas Hume become Prime Minister? Harold Macmillan, Douglas Hume's predecessor as Prime Minister, had been in the job for around 6 years when a scandal erupted, the Profumo affair, a very Cold War scandal. See the episode on Harold Macmillan for more details. With the reputation of his government damaged, Macmillan also began to have health problems, particularly with his prostate, leading him to resign on the 18th of October 1963. In the UK, the public votes for a political party, not for the Prime Minister, so when a Prime Minister resigns, the party can choose the next person in the job, although it helps, of course, if the candidate put forward is acceptable to the public. There was no clear candidate to replace Macmillan as Prime Minister, and a Conservative Party conference in Blackpool around this time very much decided the fate of potential successors. Reginald Maudlin, Lord Hailsham and Rab Butler were all identified as clear candidates, but they all fell by the wayside at this conference due to uninspiring performances, or an un-British perceived showiness, an unpalatable eagerness for the role. Amidst these numerous candidates, the idea of having a pleasant British gentleman, an aristocrat who could be seen to be one of the good chaps, but slightly above politics at the same time, clearly appealed. Seen as a moderate candidate, and in the background chosen by Macmillan as a suitable candidate to replace him, many, if not all, his rivals for the job came on board and supported his anointment as Prime Minister. There was one complication, however. That issue of Douglas Hume having inherited his title became a stumbling block once again. No such titled man had been Prime Minister since 1902, when the Marquess of Salisbury, Robert Gascoigne Cecil, ended his third stint in the job. Now, aristocrats as Prime Ministers were a normal phenomenon in the 1700s, but when the Victorian era ended in 1901, that particular era of politics also seemed to end. It was no longer seen as acceptable that someone with an inherited seat in the House of Lords could be Prime Minister. However, due to a very recent change in the law, Douglas Hume was given the ability to give up his title. This meant he could stand in a by-election and become an MP, which he promptly did, representing the seat of Kinross and West Perthshire in Scotland. Having become an MP, he could now also become the Prime Minister. In the interim, there was a strange 20-day period when Douglas Hume was Prime Minister without being either an MP or having an inherited title. Nevertheless, where there was a will, there was a way, and he became Prime Minister on the 19th of October 1963. What were Douglas Hume's biggest achievements as Prime Minister? Douglas Hume didn't help himself when he openly acknowledged that he had little knowledge of economics. In one famous quotation, he placed governmental issues in two categories. He stated, "The political ones are insoluble, and the economic ones are incomprehensible." Nevertheless, this was a time of economic stability and growth in the country. One of Douglas Hume's most noteworthy acts was to bring forward the Resale Prices Act, which stopped manufacturers being able to decide, or it could be said to fix, the prices of their products, allowing retailers to discount products or come up with their own prices. It was a small but very significant change. Even at the time, it was said that it would help bigger supermarkets over small businesses, and I guess we can now see the results of that change, for good or bad. Why did Douglas Hume stop being Prime Minister? The system where the party chooses the Prime Minister rather than the general public can be problematic, and here was a case in point. Douglas Hume wasn't a man of the people in any sense, and at the time it was commented that he was anointed by a magic circle of well-established party members, with little thought for the general public. As mentioned, however, he was the fourth Conservative leader in a row. Although there was some sense that it was time for a change, the general public also seemed to have a certain liking for this composed man. Harold Wilson, the leader of the opposition, was happy to scrap to get his party in power and using northernness to his advantage, hoping to turn Douglas Hume's unquestionable poshness to the Labour Party, the opposition's, advantage. He was scathing in his denouncement of the backward step of having an Earl as the Prime Minister after, as he said, half a century of democratic advance, of social evolution. After almost a year in the job, Douglas Hume was forced to hold a general election, because the term of Parliament was coming to an end. Douglas Hume did lose that general election, and that's how he lost the job of Prime Minister, but Harold Wilson only won with a majority of 4 seats. Even after 13 years of Conservative rule, the country proved reluctant to let Labour into power, showing that when push comes to shove, the UK public still likes an aristocrat to be in charge. Douglas Hume would enter government again when the Conservatives briefly regained power in 1970, when he would serve as Foreign and Commonwealth Secretary with Edward Heath as Prime Minister. He died in 1995 at the age of 92. Why should we remember Alec Douglas Hume? Douglas Hume was, ultimately, the exception that proved the rule. The accepted norm by 1963 was that aristocrats, that is, unelected members of the establishment, shouldn't become Prime Minister. Nevertheless, with a twist of the rules, this British gentleman did become the Premier. Although the UK public in general does seem to like an upper-class gentleman to be in charge, he also exposed what an anachronism that was, not least as the UK's centre of gravity twitched momentarily away from its traditional centres towards Liverpool. Alec Douglas Hume also exposed another truth about British politics, that even after 13 years in power, with a scandal-ridden government in charge, the British public still sometimes struggles to warm up to the alternative, the Labour Party. It happened again even more famously in the early 1990s, when John Major won a general election many, if not most, thought he would lose after another 13-year Conservative government. This time with Margaret Thatcher, then John Major, in charge. Harold Wilson only gained a 4-seat majority in the election that ousted Douglas Hume, but he would go on to strengthen his majority in another general election soon after. Although Douglas Hume and the Conservatives lost in 1964, Labour still had a lot to prove. Thank you as always everyone for listening to this episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. At this point we always put a disclaimer that this is the briefest introduction to a Prime Minister with a full and long life, so we can only give the briefest of details here in the hope that they prompt your interest to do your own research. Thank you everyone for listening to Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Number 45. Alec Douglas Hume, the archetype. Goodbye.